Our panel, Labor Senator Doug Cameron, is in our Sydney News Centre, and with me here in Canberra is Shadow Parliamentary Secretary Gary Humphries. Good morning to both of you, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Morning.
And Gary, I'll start with you. Tim Costello there talking about the need to recognise the world's poorest at the G20. Is there any room for this, or do you think they're really going to have to focus on the bigger financial institutions, the world's finances here?
Well, there has to be room for this, David. I mean, at the end of the day, it's negotiations like this that produce real change with respect to the fairness and the balance in world trade that does deliver the kind of benefits that will lift people out of poverty. We've been very successful in the last 30 years in doing just that. Millions of people have been lifted out of poverty because negotiations like these have reduced trade barriers and got access to markets that weren't there before. It's a very important process, and I hope that this particular meeting drives that process further. It's got to be at the centre of this exercise, not on the sideline.
Doug Cameron, would you agree with that sentiment?
Yes, I agree with that. I think, even though, millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, there are still many, many hundreds of millions in poverty, living on, less than $2 a day. And these are the people that tend to be forgotten. So I think the Millennium Goals, the issues of trying to lift all humanity out of poverty is a very important one.
Well, it looks like a free trade deal with Korea is almost sewn up at the moment, perhaps just a few minor details to sort out. Julia Gillard at least seems very confident that this deal will go through. Doug Cameron, is this obviously a good thing for Australia? Any credit to former governments? How long has this thing been in the works?
When I think about free trade and former governments, I think about the US Free Trade Agreement, which has been a lemon. And, really, I am a bit of a cynic in terms of some of the goals that the free trade agreements are supposed to meet, some of the econometric modelling that underpins these free trade agreements. I've asked the Treasury at last estimates to give me some advice in relation to the benefits that the free trade agreements have given Australia, or the negatives in terms of our economic performance. So I'm not quite sure that some of the over-egged claims on free trade agreements actually come true.
So are you saying that then perhaps if this deal does come through with South Korea, are you saying there could be some negatives that come through with that as well?
Well, I think there's been negatives in many of the free trade agreements, and the Labour Party's got a process now where we've tried to open up the analysis that takes place on free trade agreements. I think there should be some independent modelling as to the benefits that some of these free trade agreements provide or don't provide. I think there has to be an assessment of the social impacts as well as the economic impacts, and I think more critical analysis of free trade agreements is relevant.
Gary Humphries, do you believe that this assumption that all free trade deals are a good thing for Australia or other countries as well, is this a correct assumption?
Well, no, I wouldn't put it like that. I'm really pleased to see the old trade unionist, protectionist model coming out in Doug. It's a refreshing approach, if one that I don't agree with. Look, I mean, Doug's right. We have to check the eyes and the teeth of this sort of thing to make sure it actually works for Australia. But I don't think we've ever had a free trade agreement that hasn't worked for Australia. I dispute his assessment that the US free trade agreement hasn't been good for Australia. Speak to a number of the agricultural industries which have had markets open up as a result of that, and they'll certainly tell you that it's been a good thing. I think that we need to look at these things very carefully, but we need to invest in it as well. I'm not sure we are on the cusp of about to sign this agreement. I think this is a signal that negotiations are well underway, but I suspect we're some way yet from signing it. And in that process, lots of hard decisions will have to be made. But ultimately, it's about making it easier for markets on one country to be accessed by the other country. It's a good thing if that works. It produces jobs, it produces benefits for all around the world, and we should be doing it.
Okay, just while we're in that region at the moment, Barack Obama has reached out to Muslims in a speech to Indonesia. He and his wife also walked without shoes through a mosque. An important move abroad, no doubt, in reaching out, the US reaching out to the Muslim world. But Gary Humphries, do you think there's any political risk for someone like Barack Obama back home? There has been in the past, for example.
Oh, there are big risks for Barack Obama. He's got to accept that a large part of the US constituency is suspicious of Islam. But I think he's doing the right thing. I mean, clearly that perceived tension between the Christian West and the Islamic East is a major factor in world politics at the moment. It's driving much of the world's terrorist activity. As President of the United States, he has a premier role in actually doing something about that tension, making that dialogue quite different to what it's been in the past. I think it's the right move, and I'm sure that as a result of that, we'll make progress in dissolving some of the tension that's existed between Islam and Christianity.
Doug Cameron.
Yeah, I think he's doing exactly the right thing, and I just wish some of the conservative politicians in this country would do exactly the same. Trying to marginalise the Muslim community, marginalising Islam is not the way forward. These people have got rights. These people are big economic and social players around the world, and we do need to reach out to them, and we need to lessen the potential for terrorism, lessen the potential for social dislocation and disruption. We need to reach out and understand that the Muslim faith is a legitimate faith, and it should be treated as such.
Doug, I don't think that's a fair reflection on conservative politicians in Australia. I mean, we have in government we are very supportive of a dialogue between Islam and other communities. In government, we work very hard to make sure that we had good relations with all the key leaders there. Very, very few politicians of any persuasion these days play the religion card, and I'm sorry that you felt necessary to do that this morning.
Well, I've seen the examples of that in the Senate. I've seen it in Senate estimates. I've seen people being asked about Muslims in relationships that are costing the government money, and it was all driven from Victorian Liberal senators. So, I mean, that's the reality of where we are, and I just think it's wrong, and I think Barack Obama can take us forward on this, and I'd just like the coalition to stop some of the rhetoric they have on it.
I think we're both bigger than that, aren't we?
Okay, gentlemen, look, we're going to have to take a very quick break, but don't go away. Just before we go to that break, though, I just want to show you some pictures, or at least a picture of a little doll that the South Koreans made of Julia Gillard. I don't know if everyone's seen this, but they made a little marionette of all the world leaders. It seems, though, with Australia, they may have got Australia's national dress mixed up with that of Austria. We'll be back shortly. Don't go away. Welcome back to AM Agenda. Well, the ANZ has joined the Commonwealth Bank in raising its interest rates well above what the Reserve Bank's official rate rise was. This has drawn all sorts of angry criticism from both sides of politics, also from consumer groups and many mortgage holders out there in the community. We're still with our panel here, Doug Cameron in Sydney and Gary Humphries with me here in Canberra. Doug, I'll start with you. There was, we saw that the ANZ, in raising its rates, has actually scrapped its exit fees at the same time. This was a measure that was meant to make things easier for consumers, but it seems they've tied it here to a much bigger rate rise than expected. Is there really anything that we can do apart from throw angry words at these banks in relation to interest rates?
Yeah, I think a few angry words is okay under these circumstances. I must say that these bankers, on their $16 million a year salaries, sitting there having absolutely no concern for the society that they live in, is just outrageous. I mean, banks must have not only an obligation to the shareholders, but they also have an obligation to the society that they operate in. And it's okay if you're sitting on the shores of the Sydney Harbour in your mansion whacking interest rates up for ordinary workers. I mean, I know what it's like not to be able to pay my mortgage. I was a fitter. I had really tough times as a single income family with a couple of kids. I know what it's like not to be able to pay my mortgage. I know the stress that puts on ordinary workers, and I think it's outrageous that the banks have done what they've done, and there is absolutely no justification for it.
Gary Humphries, can you envisage anything that could be done? I mean, could for example, could we open things up to foreign banks to make it easier for them to increase competition with interest rates? Is there anything that you can think of that would work here?
I think there's plenty that can be done, David, and in fact Joe Hockey's put on the table a suite of measures that ought to be explored as a way of putting some pressure on the banks. If ever there was a week in Australian politics after the intense debate we've had about banking, when we ought to have been able to stare down the banks in raising interest rates above the recommended level by the RBA, it ought to have been this week. We've had the Prime Minister stamping her feet in Seoul and saying how angry she is, and the Treasurer pointing his finger at the banks, but it's meant nothing at all. And the fact is that a key element in this very unfortunate situation is that, compared with the giants in that Treasury portfolio in the past, like Peter Costello and Paul Keating and John Howard, Wayne Swan is a lightweight who isn't able to get traction with the banks, isn't able to persuade them to hold off on these sorts of increases, and something else does need to be done. What Joe Hockey's put on the table, I think, is a very good example of what can be done.
Well, Wayne Swan yesterday was, 2 days ago, was presiding over some pretty positive figures, you'd have to say, comparatively, in terms of the budget update. And today we're going to see some jobs numbers out at 11:30 this morning. The tip is that jobs will drop from 5.1 to 5%, and a further drop all the way down to 4.5% over the next 18 months. Any credit to the government for that?
Look, I mean, the government has a very strong economy on its hands. The economy has been strong for a decade, and the underlying strength of the Australian economy can't be denied. It would take a very incompetent government to actually do much to bring that undone. What the government does need to do, though, is address that fundamental elephant in the room, which is government spending. A number of commentators are now saying if you don't do something about reining back that spending, you're going to have a big problem on your hands. The surplus in 2 years' time is wafer thin. It's less than 1% of total government outlays. The government's got to make some hard decisions about spending, about savings, if it expects to be able to sustain that good news. It's going well at the moment, but can easily come undone if the government isn't prepared to manage the economy rather than simply cruise on the benefits and the hard decisions of the past.
Just very briefly, a response, Doug Cameron?
Yeah, look, there will be 600,000 jobs created under the Labour government since we've came to power. It's clear that the coalition want to wipe from their collective memory that we had a global financial crisis that the government handled with aplomb and with dedication to make sure we kept out of a recession. To hear Gary say that there's been 10 years of interrupted economic growth is wrong. You just can't ignore the global financial crisis. We are creating jobs because we understand that jobs are about fairness, jobs are about equity, and jobs are about social justice, and we are extremely focused on that.
Okay, there's just one last issue I just want to touch on very briefly, and that is fundraising in the political parties. Yesterday, we saw some comments from the National Press Club as the sort of the analysis of the election continues, and what's come out of it is about donations, grassroots donations. Gary Humphries, the Liberal Party, considering an Obama-style operation to gather grassroots donations. Is the party's coffers really in such trouble?
Look, they're not actually in all that bad a shape. I mean, after an election, you expect parties to be relatively poorer because they've spent the money on the things that they're designed to be doing, which is run elections. We have to look at different ways of approaching fundraising, though, and certainly other things have to be explored. The internet is a powerful new medium for reaching people and for raising money, and it has to be explored. We also have to make sure that we've got real accountability for what is being raised and spent by other players. The real concern I have at the moment is that we're seeing parties like trade unions and Get Up and the Greens effectively campaigning as surrogates for the ALP in many respects, and just not putting in the accountability for what they raise and what they spend that is expected of the major parties.
Doug Cameron, just we're out of time, but just very briefly a response to that.
It would be a travesty if the trade union movement couldn't continue to take action against policies like work choices, where workers' penalty rates, their conditions were ripped away from them. Part of the democratic process is for the trade union movement to stand up for their members.
Senator Doug Cameron in Sydney and Senator Gary Humphries here in Canberra, thanks very much for your time. We'll move on now to the community